For generations, the Hopi preserved stories of worlds beneath the earth, stories of emergence, survival, and mysterious beings associated with an underground realm. Centuries later, in 1909, an Arizona newspaper published an extraordinary account of an underground complex hidden inside the Grand Canyon. The report described chambers, mummies, weapons, inscriptions, and evidence it claimed could connect ancient Arizona to Egypt and the Orient. The newspaper was real, but the expedition it described has never been verified. So why has the story survived for more than a century? And why do people continue to place it beside ancient Hopi traditions? To understand the mystery, we have to go back before the newspaper in modern archaeology. Hopi traditions include an emergence story in which ancestors passed through earlier worlds before entering the present one. The Sipapu represents that emergence into the current world. Traditions also speak of beings often described as ant people, associated with an underground realm and with helping ancestors survive difficult times. These traditions belong to Hopi cultural and spiritual history. They should not be treated as archaeological reports simply because modern readers find certain details intriguing. The National Park Service likewise describes Sipapu as a Hopi concept meaning a place of emergence and connects it with ancestral emergence traditions. And that distinction matters because the modern Grand Canyon mystery did not begin with the Hopi. It began with a newspaper story. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a front-page article titled, "Explorations in Grand Canyon." It claimed that an explorer named G.E. Kincaid had discovered a vast underground citadel somewhere along the canyon. According to the article, the site was extraordinarily difficult to reach, and the expedition was supposedly connected to the Smithsonian Institution. The newspaper described passages and chambers, artifacts, copper weapons, pottery, inscriptions, and mummies. It even suggested that the people who had occupied the cavern might have come from the Orient or ancient Egypt. Then the report became even stranger. It described a deep main passage, numerous rooms, preserved grain, weapons, mysterious writings, and a crypt containing mummies. If true, it would have rewritten the history of North America. But there was a problem. Where was the evidence? The Arizona Gazette really did publish the story, but no authenticated archaeological site matching its description has emerged, and no confirmed collection of Egyptian artifacts from the supposed expedition exists. The Smithsonian has repeatedly stated that it has no record of the expedition or of the named individuals as Smithsonian employees. Modern reference sources likewise describe the story as false or unsupported. The newspaper was real. The expedition itself is not established by surviving evidence. And that creates the first great divide in the mystery. If the story was genuine, one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries in American history left almost no reliable institutional trail. No confirmed excavation report, no authenticated artifact collection, no accepted archaeological site. But if the story was fabricated, another question remains. Why did it become so compelling? Part of the answer lies in the world of 1909. Archaeology was still developing. The American Southwest attracted explorers and journalists, and public fascination with ancient civilizations was enormous. Newspapers competed for attention, and spectacular discoveries could become national stories overnight. The Arizona Gazette report had everything a dramatic story needed: an inaccessible location, a mysterious explorer, an underground civilization, ancient writing, mummies, and a possible lost connection between continents. Yet the closer we examine the story, the harder it becomes to separate evidence from storytelling. And this is where the Hopi traditions return. The similarities are intriguing, but they must be handled carefully. Hopi traditions describe emergence from an underground world and beings associated with that realm. The 1909 newspaper described an underground complex hidden within the Grand Canyon. Both narratives involve a world beneath the surface, but similarity is not proof. The Hopi tradition does not authenticate the newspaper article, and the newspaper article does not prove that Hopi oral traditions were describing the same physical location. Treating the two as direct evidence for each other would reduce a complex indigenous tradition to a modern mystery narrative. The traditions have their own meaning and history, independent of the newspaper. Still, the comparison raises a fascinating question. Could people in different eras have been responding to the same landscape in different ways? Or are modern researchers simply connecting details that were never connected? there is no reliable evidence that allows us to answer that with certainty. Then there is the Smithsonian connection. The 1909 article claimed that the institution was financing the exploration and that a professor named S.A. Jordan was directing the work. That claim would make the story especially important, because an official Smithsonian expedition should have generated records. Instead, the Smithsonian has repeatedly denied having records of the expedition or the named researchers as employees. For historians, this is one of the strongest reasons to reject the story. But the wording matters. The absence of surviving records does not prove that every detail is impossible. Records can be lost or never created. But when an alleged expedition supposedly uncovered one of America's greatest archaeological discoveries, the absence of independent evidence becomes a serious problem. There is another layer, the Grand Canyon itself. Its cliffs contain caves, alcoves, passages, and formations created over millions of years. Some areas are extremely difficult to reach, but the existence of natural caves does not prove that the enormous man-made cavern described by the 1909 article existed. It simply means the landscape was capable of hiding places that were difficult for outsiders to see. That leaves us with several possibilities. The simplest is that the newspaper story was a hoax or sensational fabrication. Another is that the report was based on a real location or expedition but greatly exaggerated what was found. A third is that some records were lost, leaving later generations with only the newspaper account. Finally, the Hopi traditions in the 1909 story may be completely unrelated, with later storytellers emphasizing their similarities. The evidence does not give us a hidden civilization, an Egyptian colony, or a secret Smithsonian discovery. What it gives us is more complicated. We have a genuine 1909 newspaper article, extraordinary claims, no archaeological confirmation, institutional denials, a vast landscape, and indigenous traditions that existed independently of the newspaper. That is where the real mystery lives, in the gap between what was reported and what can actually be demonstrated. More than a century later, the better question is this: why did a story with so little surviving evidence become one of America's most persistent archaeological legends? Perhaps the answer lies partly in the canyon itself. Its cliffs hide narrow ledges, caves, ancient sites, and places that remain difficult to access. To someone standing at the rim, the canyon can feel almost infinite. It is easy to understand why stories of hidden worlds could take root there. But the Hopi traditions did not need the Arizona Gazette to become meaningful. They existed before it and continue to belong to a living cultural tradition. The newspaper story, by contrast, became famous largely because it remains unverified. One is cultural memory, the other is a disputed historical report. The responsible approach is to examine what each can actually tell us. The newspaper tells us about 1909, journalism, exploration, public fascination, and the appetite for spectacular discoveries. The Hopi traditions tell us about a much older cultural understanding of emergence, survival, and sacred geography. The Grand Canyon tells us something else. Landscapes can preserve mysteries longer than institutions preserve records. But mystery is not proof, and uncertainty is not confirmation. So, after more than a century, where does that leave us? Perhaps the 1909 expedition was an elaborate fabrication. Perhaps a real discovery was transformed into something extraordinary. Perhaps missing records conceal a fragment of truth. Or perhaps the connection to the Hopi traditions exists only in the imagination of later generations. We cannot honestly claim to know. What we can say is that the story survives because it sits at the intersection of three powerful forces: an ancient cultural tradition, a dramatic historical report, and one of the most mysterious landscapes in North America. Maybe that is why the legend refuses to disappear. Not because the hidden city has been proven, not because the Smithsonian buried the evidence, and not because an ancient civilization has been confirmed beneath the canyon. It survives because history sometimes leaves us with questions instead of answers. A newspaper from 1909, a tradition preserved for generations, a canyon filled with places that are difficult to reach, and a mystery that continues to invite the same question: what, if anything, lies beneath the stories we inherited? Perhaps someday archaeology, technology, or newly discovered records will give us a definitive answer. Until then, the responsible conclusion is also the most intriguing one. The legend is real as a story. The newspaper is real as a historical document, but the underground civilization it described remains unproven. And somewhere between those three facts, the mystery continues. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history, archaeology, indigenous traditions, and unresolved historical mysteries, subscribe for more investigations. Now I want to hear your theory. Was the 1909 story simply a newspaper hoax, or could it have been based on something real that was later lost to history? The evidence may not give us the answer, but the question remains.